So I love history. I think I've shared with you before that before I felt God had called me into ministry, I actually wanted to be a history teacher. And I've shared that with people over the years. I've told others that that was my desire at one point in time, and it always gets pretty much the same response. And that response is always, why history? History's so boring. And my reaction to that is that history in and of itself is not boring, because history is the story of how we got to where we are as human beings. It's the story of us. History teachers can be boring, but if you get a good one like Jerry Keck, they'll make history come alive to you. He's not here today, so if somebody could tell him I said that next week. I haven't been in his class in 25 years, but I'm still trying to get extra credit. So if you guys could help me out with that, I'd appreciate it. But I love history. It's one of the things that I think is just fascinating about us. It's this, again, the story of how we got to where we are as people. And throughout history, have been men and women who have shaped the world around us, both in good and in bad ways. But their stories, I think, are some of the most interesting things that we could share. It's kind of an intriguing thing. Because the world has been shaped by various people throughout history, because these men and women who are either leaders of nations or leaders of movements have sparked change in the world around them, I find it interesting to go back and look at some of their final public speeches. Those last few words that they have for the people that they have led, I think, are incredibly interesting things. Now, some of these people, they know that this is going to be their last public address because maybe they're leaving the public eye and they're heading for more of a private life to kind of conclude the days that they have. A lot of them, because people who change history are not always beloved, don't realize that this is going to be their final speech. These will be the last words that they share with the people that they have led. But it's always fascinating to me to go back and look at those last few public words that they have, especially when we keep in mind what they had led people through, what they had driven them through, because it's something that's always going to be on their minds as they are addressing the people that they're in charge of, the ones that they want to lead in whatever direction they're supposed to. It's always a fascinating thing, but sometimes, because of the way that they end up passing away, their last speeches can be overshadowed. The last few words that they have to share with us can be overshadowed simply because the manner in which their life ends is so dramatic. For example, every single one of us, we know that President Abraham Lincoln attended Ford's Theater one night where he was shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth. We know that. We know that that's how Lincoln's life ended. But not many of us know what Lincoln's final speech was actually about. Lincoln's final speech took place just 2 days after the surrender of the Confederacy that brought about the end of the Civil War. Lincoln stood outside the White House addressing on a balcony to a crowd of people that had gathered there some of his thoughts. And this particular speech was actually framed around the notion of how do we reincorporate and re-imply these Confederate states back into the Union? How do we get from the place where we're no longer two separate nations but back to being one United States of America? And he did this all through the lens work of the state of Louisiana. And the reason why Lincoln had picked Louisiana in the first place is because Louisiana as a state had just completely elected new government officials that had made about incredible changes in just a couple of days. They formally abolished slavery in the state of Louisiana, something that had not happened yet. They promised public education for for all citizens regardless of race. And even this system of government in Louisiana was toying around publicly with the idea of allowing African Americans who had just freely been given their freedom the right to vote. Something that even in the northern states was being hotly contested and debated amongst different political circles. And so Lincoln framed around this entire speech around the question, can Louisiana be brought into proper practical relations with the Union sooner by sustaining or by quickly discarding the new state government? The question is do we allow this new state government in Louisiana that's already brought about what most of the northern Union states would consider to be positive changes? Can we quickly incorporate them by leaving that government in place, or should we discard it altogether and start over? As Lincoln was addressing this crowd, it was pretty clear that he thought that the quickest path to resolution was to allow Louisiana back into the Union with the same people in power. That he thought that that would be the smoothest way for us to be able to welcome back in this once separate state that had joined the Confederacy within it. He was quick to want to do that. And we consider that Lincoln had never wanted the Civil War to happen in the first place. That during the Civil War, Lincoln did everything that he thought possible to bring about a quick resolution to it. It makes sense that he would want to bring about peace and restoration as quickly as he possibly could. Almost everyone in Lincoln's circles had noted that over the last several years of the Civil War, Lincoln himself had aged rather rapidly. That the stress of having to make these weighty decisions and leading people in a war of brother versus brother had just worn on him so much. And so it makes a lot of sense that, he'd want to bring about peace and restoration and reincorporation as fast as he could, if for no other reason than to take some stress off of him. So that maybe this could happen. He knew that the wounds that the Civil War had inflicted on us were so deep and so gaping that he thought maybe the fastest way for us to put this all behind us and to come back together as a people is to just let him back in. To just do it freestanding. But also in this speech, Lincoln himself seemed to side with the idea that African Americans should be allowed the right to vote. And when we remember that this is the man who penned the Emancipation Proclamation, when we know that this is the man who fought hard to make sure that slavery was abolished in the United States, it makes sense that he would want them the right to vote as well. And Lincoln, through this speech, was able to do something that only he could really do effectively. And that was he managed to irritate people on both sides of the aisle. Lincoln was a master at making everybody mad. People on the northern side of it thought that Lincoln was being far too forgiving. He was far too quick to just let them back in, to give them a pass and be back in the Union. They thought that that was ridiculous. They shouldn't do that. That there should be some sort of a penance that these states would have to pay if they wanted to come back and join the United States of America. But people on the southern side of the argument, people who were not for the African American vote, were very angry, including one man who was in attendance, a white supremacist who stood there on the lawn listening as Lincoln gave this final speech, and when Lincoln had concluded, said the words, "That will be the last public speech he ever gives." That man's name was John Wilkes Booth. And just 3 days later, he would end the president's life. It makes sense that in his last public address, Lincoln would do whatever he could to sway people towards reconciliation and reconnection. The wounds of the Civil War were deep. And so the sooner we could get past that, maybe the sooner we could heal as a nation. We could come back together and grow as a people. He had led the Union through this bloody battle, through this war that had cost far too many lives. So is it any wonder why he longed so hard for peace? Is it any wonder why this president who led what up to that point in time was the bloodiest war that the Americas had ever fought? Is it any wonder why he wanted so badly to see peace established amongst his people? And he understood that this nation was entering into a brand new phase, a new arena that we had never been in before, that we were on the cusp of something exciting and something new. And even though he did not know this would be his last public address, it still showed his heart and his desire for something new and something peaceful, to be brought out of the hardships that he had led this nation through. It's not too different from the same mindset that Moses was in our text today, We're going to find ourselves in Deuteronomy chapter 6 today. So if you would please turn there in your Bibles, get there on your apps. But as you're doing so, normally I would give you context. I would tell you what's going on around this particular book, but I don't want to do that today. Instead, I want to remind you of just what the book of Deuteronomy actually is. The book of Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Old Testament. It is the last book of what is known as the Pentateuch. The first 5 books of the Bible, these are the books of law. Whenever generations after this would go back and study Scripture, these would be the 5 books that they would study most severely, because this is where Moses himself would establish the laws for the nation of Israel. This is something that is hugely significant for these people, because this is a book where Moses lays out nearly everything as far as what the people of Israel are expected to follow as they enter into the promised land of God. Up till now, they've not had a nation of their own, but as Moses is penning the book of Deuteronomy, as he's writing this last little blurb here, he knows that they're about to go and take what was supposed to be theirs for generations. And the book of Deuteronomy is actually structured and laid out as a recording of what Moses shared with the Israelites near the end of his life. As the book ends with recording Moses' actual death. In essence, the book of Deuteronomy is Moses' final speech. For a moment, I want you to try to picture Moses as he's developing and organizing these thoughts, knowing that this is probably the last public address that he's going to give these people. For most of his adult life, Moses has been the one to lead the Israelites. He has been the one who freed them from the captivity in Egypt. He has led them all the way through till this particular moment when they are on the cusp of doing something incredible. He has been their leader through thick and through thin. And throughout his time as the leader of these people, Moses has run the gambit of emotions with them. There was one instance where his love for these people was so strong within him that he actually pleaded with God not to wipe them out. God had gotten so frustrated with the Israelites that he had threatened to wipe them off the face of the earth and start over with just Moses and his family. And in Exodus chapter 32, verses 11 and 12, it says this: Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. Lord, why does your anger burn against your people who you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a strong hand? Why should the Egyptians say he brought them out with an evil intent to kill them in the mountains and eliminate them from the face of the earth? Turn your fierce anger and relent concerning this disaster planned for your people. Moses' love for the Israelites was so great that when God even just hinted at the idea of being done with them, he pleaded with God, no, spare them, Lord. They're worth saving. But Moses also had a moment where he would rather die than continue to lead the Israelites. In Numbers chapter 11, verses 14 and 15, Moses said, I can't carry all these people by myself. They are too much for me. If you're going to treat me like this, please kill me now if I have found favor with you. And don't let me see my misery anymore. That is quite the spectrum of emotions for one guy, right? I love these people so much. Oh my goodness, please just kill me so I don't have to deal with them anymore. That's kind of what leadership is like sometimes. You love it and you don't love it. I love being a minister. I really do. It is the joy of my life. But there are those days where I'm just like, hey, God, can't I just hang drywall? That'd be more fun. I don't think I've ever gotten to the extreme where it's like, hey, God, kill me, please, so I don't have to do this anymore. I've never gotten to that level yet. But that's where Moses is at. He's run that whole gamut with him. And so as he's getting ready to write this last speech, as he's getting ready for this, he knows where they're about to go. He knows what they're about to walk into. They're about to finally take the promised land. They're about to finally establish themselves as a nation unto themselves. They have never had that before. For so long of the Israelite history, they had been nomadic, they had been slaves. They had never been a nation unto themselves. And Moses knows that they are about to walk into that. but he knows he's not going with them. He knows that he won't see this happen. And so he knows that his last speech needs to be somewhat memorable. That if this is going to be the last thing that he says to these people that he has led for so long, that he loves so desperately, that at times he's so irritated with, he wants to knock their heads together. He knows that this needs to be something that's going to stick with them. He senses the weight and the importance of what he is about to tell these people. But if I could just ask your indulgence a little bit more, I want to try to look at the other side of this equation, the other side of this discussion that's taking place, and try and imagine at this moment for what it's like for those who are in attendance. For the people who are standing there listening as Moses delivers this final speech, for nearly all of them, I would almost even argue for all of them, but at least for nearly all of them, Moses is the only leader they've ever had. He's always been the guy, the one who would make all of the decisions for all these people. He is the one who, when Moses says this, this is what it is. When everything is great, Moses is the best dude around. When everything's less than great, well, we all know who to blame. But for their entire lives, Moses has been the dude. And so while they're excited, because how could you not be excited? You're about to be a part of something incredible. You're about to be part of the group that finally goes and takes the promised land, something that was promised over 400 years ago to Abraham, that your people have been talking about for generations of looking for this day, and you're now going to be a part of that. But the guy who's always led you isn't going to be there. So while there's excitement for what's going to happen, there's also got to be some fear, right? Some uncertainty about what's going to happen because the guy who's always been at the helm isn't going to go with us. I remember as a kid, I want to say it would have been the 92 elections, but I don't think that's right because I think it's probably closer to the 96. This is the first time in my life I was ever aware of the presidential elections, that we would have a change in leadership. When you're a kid, you don't recognize who's in charge, right? Everybody's the same. But I remember being a kid, and I'm finally aware of, oh, hey, our country, we change leaders every now and again. And I remember being terrified by that. Like, what happens? Like, I know we vote in November, but they don't become president until January. So we just not have a government for like 6 weeks? That's terrifying. What if everything falls apart? Right? I remember being scared of that. And I've learned that happens every 4 to 8 years. We don't worry about that anymore because everything's going to be fine. It doesn't matter who's in office. There's still going to be a screw up. But for these people, Moses had been it. There had never been anybody else. And so if Moses is not going to be our leader anymore, how do we know this is going to work? And so they're listening as Moses is delivering this last speech, and you got to imagine they're listening rather intently because they're looking to their leader that they have known their entire lives share his last thoughts with them. So it makes sense that as Moses is getting into this speech that would be his final address to these people, that he lays out exactly what their priorities ought to be. That as they go and they establish this new land, and as they lead into this place that they have never been, and they establish themselves as a new kingdom, Moses would tell them exactly what the priorities are. In the first 5 chapters of Deuteronomy, Moses really kind of starts off by first telling them where they've been. Right? Chapters 1 through 5 of Deuteronomy kind of work as a recap of everything that Moses has led them through. Everything that they've endured, everything that they have seen, everything that they have witnessed, whether this generation had seen it or not, Moses is still reminding them of the things that they already know. But when Moses gets to chapter 6, the whole thing kind of turns. Because this is when Moses is no longer talking about the past, he is talking about what is to come. But before he gets into what the laws ought to be and the ways that they should structure this government and the things that they need to do and the things they need to avoid doing, he starts off by listing what is the most important priority for them to hold? What is the most important thing? And in fact, this is going to become something that Moses repeats throughout the rest of Deuteronomy. And in fact, not only is it repeated in the rest of Deuteronomy, it's repeated through the rest of the Bible. Old Testament, New Testament, this first command, this first priority that Moses lays out becomes so influential that Jesus himself would identify it as the most important command. We see it in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. It says, "Listen, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." Moses has built towards this moment in his final speech, and he is clearly laying it out as this as being the most important thing. If you remember nothing else of what Moses says in the rest of Deuteronomy, and there's a lot of Deuteronomy to go, remember this. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. It makes perfect sense. This is what Moses would point to as being the single most important thing for the Israelites to do when you consider everything that God has done for the nation of Israel, not just for Moses himself. This is the same God that he's telling them to love that utilized 10 plagues as a way to soften Pharaoh's heart to finally get them out of the slavery that they had been in for over 400 years. This is the same God that as they were leaving Egypt and they came across this gigantic obstacle known as the Red Sea, parted the waters so that they could walk on dry land. This is the same God that when Pharaoh and his army chased after them as they were still in the Red Sea, collapsed the sea on top of them, killing all of their enemies to make sure that there was nobody getting in the way of them going to establish this nation. This is the same God that saw to it that they, even though they had no idea where they were going, he would be the one who would direct them as a cloud by day and as a pillar of fire by night. We actually talked about that in youth group this week, the idea of the pillar of fire by night, and we just said that was like the most metal thing that God could have picked. It was awesome. A pillar of fire. Nobody else thinks that's cool? All right, fine. This is the same God who, when they ran out of their own supplies, he made sure that their most basic of human needs was met. When they were hungry, God provided manna. When they decided they were tired of just bread, God gave them quail as well. When they got thirsty, God told Moses, hey, go to that rock and there will be water there. This is the same God who has been there time after time after time for these people. And Moses knew that this was going to be the same God who would continue to be there for him after Moses himself had passed. So love the Lord your God. Don't just love him with a little bit. Don't just give him a little bit of flowers here and there. Love him with everything you've got. With every fiber of your being. Love the Lord your God. He's the reason that they were here to begin with, not Moses. The legacy of the land that they were about to take would not just be the land itself, it would be the faith that brought them to that land. So love the Lord your God. And again, throughout the rest of Deuteronomy, Moses would keep going back to this statement over and over and over again. He would keep reminding them to love their God, to respect his laws because of that love. But here, as Moses has issued this decree, he wants to make sure that the Israelites understand the gravity and the importance of this particular command, because he goes on with further instructions in verses 6 through 9. There he says, these words that I am giving you today are to be in your heart. Repeat them to your children. Talk about them when you sit in your house and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them be a symbol on your forehead. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your city gates. It is not enough in Moses' mind that these people should just listen to what he has to say. It is not enough in Moses' mind that these people be reminded of all that God has done for them as a reason as to why they should love the Lord their God. It's not enough for these people to be here to listen as Moses just gives them commands. Moses wants them to repeat these stories of faith, to talk about God constantly, to constantly remind themselves of the way that God has intervened and the ways that God has shown himself and his love for the Israelites, to be able to talk about all the ways that God has impacted their lives, to not just treasure them in their heart, but to share them all the time. Tell it to your kids. Talk about it when you're in your house. Talk about it when you're outside your house. Talk about it everywhere that you go with everybody that you can meet. Write it on your hands. Tattoo it on your forehead. Talk about how much God has done for these people. Repeat these notions over and over again. This love that they're to have for God is not just meant for themselves. It is meant for everyone that they come in contact with. For every person that they interact with, talk about these stories of God and the ways that he has impacted your lives and the faith that you have because of him. We know the importance. I'll even go so far as to say the need. I'll even go so far as to say the command for us to share our faith. Lord knows in the last 4 years you've heard me say that phrase over and over and over again. To the point that some of you may be rolling your eyes right now, oh, another one of these sermons. You know that. We know this is an incredibly important thing for us to do, to make sure that those around us know about the love that Jesus has for each and every one of us. But, please hear me when I say this, sharing our faith with the people around us is not just for their benefit. Don't get me wrong. It is very much for their benefit that we share our faith because it gives them an opportunity to come to the feet of the cross and find Jesus for themselves. However, sharing the stories of the way that God has intervened himself in our lives and the ways that God has shown up and made himself known to us has tremendous benefit for us as well. We benefit from sharing our faith. When we commit to sharing our faith with the world around us, we get a chance to talk about the ways that God has continued to show up in our faith. We get a chance to talk about the ways that we have grown, not only in our knowledge of him, but also in our love for him. And when we take a step back, and when we look back at the ways that God has interacted in our lives, it does nothing more than deepen our appreciation. I'll even go so far as to say our love for God himself. Because we're reminded of all the things that have happened, all that God has led us through, all the ways that he has made his presence felt in our lives. And when we do that, how could we not be appreciative of what he has done? Sharing our faith consistently, I'll even go so far as to use the word constantly, reminds us of how great God has been in our lives, and it leads us to love him even more. This might seem like a strange analogy, but I want you to stick with me for a moment. But this is kind of like a couple that's been together forever. Right? You know those couples. Maybe you are that couple. You've been together longer than you've ever been apart. You don't really remember what life was like without this person. But you still share those stories about your relationship, don't you? You share those stories about the day that you met. You share the story about your first date and about how he was kind of dorky, but you thought he was great anyway. Or The ways that she made you so nervous because you couldn't understand how a girl so pretty could ever possibly talk to you. You share those stories about the day he proposed. Maybe you share the story of your wedding day. Maybe you talk about the days that your first kid was born, or you share these glimpses of what your life was like. If you ever watch a couple who does that, you can kind of see a glow come back to them. Because they're reminding themselves not only of how they felt when those stories were taking place, about the ways that they felt about each other, they're also reminding themselves of everything that they've walked through together. Of every way that life has challenged them and yet they've stayed faithful. Of every way in which it felt like things were falling apart around them, but they leaned on each other. And it makes them love one another even more. I know that to be the case for myself. I love sharing the stories of Mandy and I's life together. Because it makes me appreciate her even more. It makes me respect her even more. And yes, it makes me love her even more. And so when we share these stories of the ways that God has shown up in our lives, when we tell people about our faith by sharing our stories of Him, yes, it helps them out because it gives them that opportunity to come to know Jesus for themselves. But it also reminds us of what God has led us through. And about the ways that He has shown up and about the ways that He has consistently loved us even when we felt like we weren't worthy about that. When we share those stories about how we first heard the gospel or about why we chose to be baptized or the way that God showed up for us when it seemed like all hope was lost, it reminds us of how incredible God has been in our lives. And it helps us to know just how much more deep and rich our relationship with Him is. And it makes us love God even more. Moses didn't just use part of his final speech in front of the Israelites to tell them to love God. He also told them to remind themselves of all that God had done in their midst constantly and to remind themselves by telling those stories to others. To pass along all those things that had happened. He knew repeating these stories of faith would strengthen and deepen that faith. That it would strengthen and deepen that love for God, that love that is supposed to be all-consuming, that love that we are supposed to give with everything that we have within us. When we tell others of all that God has done, when we share our faith by sharing our stories, we find that not only can it create room for them to find their way to the foot of the cross, but it'll help deepen our own love for God. So share your faith, not just for the benefit of the listener, because I promise it'll benefit you as well. The Apostle Paul would write in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, and we'll close with it this morning. He said, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and then also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith."